All right, so as some of you may know, I co-chair the Clinical Research Ethics Board at UBC for the past over a year, and so I've seen a lot of applications go through, and I know what the board is looking for, and I'm going to give some tips today about how to get your projects through, no matter how unethical they are. So, for example, let's say you get a drug, Dr. Gleave, that you want to test, but you're not sure, you don't have a good target population. Might be a good idea if you found a target population and then infected them and then treated them with your agent. That'd be a good idea. I'm going to show you how you can get your application through. Let's say, Karush, you want to test natural history. Look at the natural history of viral pathogen in children. Well, we can get that through as well, no problem. You want a big population of people to test all your new chemicals that you're developing. You're collaborating with Pharmon, no problem. We'll find you cheap and willing volunteer children to do that. That's not an issue. Of course, as you know, this is not going to be the focus of this talk, and in fact, these three events have occurred in the past already. In 1946, the U.S. Public Health Service, which is an arm of the U.S. government, conducted Guatemala syphilis trials where they deliberately infected prostitutes, prisoners, soldiers with syphilis to look at the natural history of syphilis, as well as the efficacy of penicillin treatment at that time. In the 1950s, Willowbrook State School is a state-run school for the mentally challenged children, housing up to 6,000 children, and doctors within the facility purposely infected these kids with hepatitis virus to examine the natural history of the disease. And in 2004, so quite a contemporary example, the Children's Environmental Exposure Research Study sponsored by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was testing the exposure of pesticides on predominantly low-income black children. So as you can see, there are multiple examples of unethical behavior sponsored by state-run or governmental agents, which leads us to the actual objectives of the talk. Understand a little bit about the principles of ethical conduct of research, understand the roles of IRBs or research ethic boards, and UBC CREB in general, and in particular, overview of the CREB application process and pitfalls thereof, and some current issues in research ethics. So how important exactly are ethics in today's set? Well, I've given some examples, but there's some very classic examples always quoted in the medical ethics literature. This is one of them, the Tuskegee experiments. Again, U.S. Public Health Service and the Tuskegee Institute went to African-American sharecroppers in the South, recruited 600 of them, 399 who had syphilis, and offered them free meals, free medical treatment, treatment of their bad blood, they called it. In fact, the researchers were interested in the natural history of syphilis and denied these people treatment for their syphilis, and in fact actively prevented those with syphilis from getting treatment even from other sources. And this went on for over 40 years. In 1972, the Assistant Secretary for Health and Scientific Affairs struck a committee, obviously finding this study unethical and putting a close to it. The NAACP won a class action lawsuit. And in 1997, President Clinton offered an apology to remaining 8 survivors of this trial. Still, doesn't make up for the base, unethical, unrationalized, poorly planned study that it was. If you look at examples within the U.S. military even, there are multiple examples of unethical type studies where you have a captive audience who are not allowed to not volunteer for these types of studies. This is a blurb about a Navy seaman named Nathan who volunteered to go into a locked room where chemical weapons were infused into the chamber over 5 days. He collapsed after that, and he was told never to tell anybody about it, but obviously the gist of it is that the U.S. government at that time was testing chemical warfare on a whole host of GIs. In 1993, the National Academy of Sciences exposed this type of research within the U.S. military, but it had already gone on for more than 30 years. So over 60,000 American GIs were used in such testing, and 210,000 civilians were also tested through a 20-year period to radiation-type treatment. And of course, who can forget these guys? These guys are the ultimate example of unethical behavior, conducting torturous and unrationalized experiments on a whole host of, across a whole host of areas on concentration camp prisoners. After the war ended, in 1947, the doctor's trial was held against Karl Brandt and 22 other Nazi conspirators in Nuremberg, Germany. And the judgment out of this quoted the 10 points of the Nuremberg Code. And this started going towards defining legitimate research for the world. The Nuremberg Code is often quoted, rarely seen. I just quote it here for you. I'm not going to go over it, but it does go towards issues relating towards issues of consent, beneficence, equipoise of the research, do no harm, qualification of the research team, and participant autonomy. The Nuremberg Code is actually derived from 6 points of the Declaration of Helsinki originally and added 4 more new points. And the Declaration itself was adopted in 1964 in Helsinki, Finland by the World Medical Association. It's considered a foundational document in terms of guiding research ethics and continues to be refined ongoing, most recent in 2013. Interestingly, however, the US FDA continues to ignore all revisions after the year 2000 and has removed all references to the declaration within the documents, instead now favoring good clinical practice. GCP is a set of standards set out by the International Conference on Harmonization, which is more focused on methodology of clinical trials and human participant research, less so on the moral principles and guidance. So easier to transpose into standard operating documents and procedures and protocols.
Is that why the FDA has moved on from the Helsinki Declaration?
Yes, that's exactly the reason. So if you take the Belmont report, which fell out of the Tuskegee trials, the Declaration, the Declaration or the Nuremberg Code, and so on, and apply it to your local area, every different locale interprets these rules and regulations differently and forms their own documentation. In the U.S., the Department of Health and Human Services is responsible for human-based research, and the often quoted rule is the Federal Regulations Title 45, Part 46, which occurs in exact format, exact terminology across 15 different departments. It's now commonly referred to as the Common Rule. It goes towards, again, the health and safety of research participants, as well as human rights. Accepting this, of course, are the CIA, Social Security, and Homeland Security. In Canada, the Tri-Council, the Chair Ensterk and Shirk, created an interagency panel on research ethics, or PRE, to promote ethical conduct of research. And PRE develops the Tri-Council policy statement on the ethical conduct for research involving humans, which is basically a giant manual which basically outlines all the things you can and cannot do in human trials or research involving human biospecimens, biorepositories, data regarding humans, so on and so forth. This document was first made in 1988 and undergoes ongoing review as well. TCPS itself is based only on 3 main core principles: respect for persons, concern for welfare, and justice. If we take a step back and ask, what is research ethics in general? It's a field of ethics that systemically analyzes ethical, privacy, and legal questions raised by research involving humans, and works best when applied before you actually do the research. That is to say, you don't do the research, encounter a problem, and try to put the horse back in the barn. It's a set of guidelines and regulations and thinking where you approach the problem at hand, identify issues beforehand, try to mitigate those risks, and then begin to conduct your research. Obviously, one does not simply experiment without considering ethics. So what's the CREB purpose? The purpose is to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects participating in research within the UBC umbrella. UBC CREB oversees all human-related trials, whether that's data from living subjects, dead subjects, human data derived in the past, present, or future, biorepositories, registry data, and so on. Its governing principles mirror a lot of the elements derived from the Declaration, GCP, and so on: respect for autonomy, no harm, doing good to others, so beneficence, recognizing the duty of researchers in the publication of data, including negative trials. The UBC CREB was established and powered by the Board of Governors and the VP Research of the university, and ascribes to the Policy 89 of the university in terms of research regarding human participants, and this is a policy that can be looked at online if you have obviously a lot of time on your hands. If you look at the Reporting structure of UBC. The names change all the time, but you get an idea of the layout of reporting here. You see that under VP Research, UBC CREB reports separately, but is not linked to this org chart. That way it has arm's length ability to review with some level of separation all the studies that pass through it, and reports directly to VP Research, who in turn reports directly to the Vice Chancellor, President, and Board of Governors. So what can the CREB do? So you submit an application, you start conducting research, and the REB obviously has to approve that research going forward, but also has the authority to monitor that research and review all the other documentation that comes in. So review of regular progress reports, changes in or amendments to that study, any adverse events or safety issues, and then the REB can come back, feedback on that, and continue to offer advice about review or monitoring issues, suspend or terminate the study, or place restrictions.
Chris, can you go back one slide? The VP Research does not report to the President. He does.
They do eventually, yeah, through the Deputy Vice Chancellor. So what happens if you're a chronic offender of the UBC CREB? Well, obviously, you'll have restricted ability to submit further REB applications, which probably won't deter you because you're an offender in the first place. However, you may have reduced ability to seek grants because most grant funding agencies will require some documentation with regards to REB approval prior to administering the grant funding or even accepting your grant application. Reduced ability to publish the findings in reputable journals for the same reason. And in the end, it may affect your UBC appointment. And if you don't care about UBC appointment, then your clinical appointment if you're a physician. And if you don't care about that, then obviously legal repercussions. UBC CREB is one of 6 UBC affiliated research boards operating under the umbrella. And you have Children's and Women's Behavioral, Okanagan Providence, and BC Cancer Agency. And the good thing is that the REBs have gotten together over the past about 6 years ago so that if you have a cross-cutting project, so say an adolescent study that's moving into children or into VGH or St. Paul's, or a cancer study going from VGH to St. Paul's and Cancer Agency, you only have to apply once, so you only have to have one board of record, and the other boards will examine that common application and provide comments. So how do you get started? So you have an idea. You're wondering, does this project even require ethics review? Because not all do. You get a lot of questions. Right? Is it legal? Is it ethical? Privacy issues, so on. Is it even research? So TCPS 2 defines research as an undertaking intended to extend knowledge through discipline, inquiry, or systemic investigation, and focuses explicitly on the intention of the researcher as opposed to the outcome. Policy 89 also basically has the same language and goes on to say that any study involving living human beings or human biological materials will need ethical review. In addition to those 2 elements, these are the other types of studies that will require CREB review. So living biological materials, secondary use of data or samples, that is data that was collected or samples that were collected for some other purpose, you want to repurpose those for a study, that will require CREB review. Collecting new types of data from humans, use of data from an existing registry or database derived from humans, creation of said database or registry, and creation of a biobank. Now, one of the often contested issues from PIs to the board is why do I have to get consent, and why do I have to get consent from all of these people, all these participants, even if they're dead, or it's a retrospective study, or it's not practicable to do so because we're doing studies in the Arctic or studies in Mount Everest or something like that. That's true. There is provision for waiver of consent if it's not practicable to get consent from each individual participant. And this is baked into the application itself. It's called a waiver of consent. So if you can meet these 6 criteria, then and convince the board that you still need the data based on this, then you can waive that consent for individual participants and just continue with the study understanding that you have other responsibilities. First, that the identifiable information is essential for your research. The use of this information is unlikely to affect the welfare of the participant. You're going to take appropriate measures to safeguard that information. You're going to comply with any known preferences that those participants have issued. It's basically, this is the most common reason it's impossible and practical to seek individual consent. So a retrospective case study of 200,000 people, you're not going to go and get 200,000 consents. And you have to comply with any other permissions or for secondary use of that information. So there are types of studies which do not require CREB review. You should be aware of these so that you don't have to waste your time submitting. Article 4.3 states that any publicly available information, so information scraped from the internet, from the library, from US government, from other data sources where you do not require permits or other documentation, do not require CREB review. Any study where you're doing observation in public places also does not require REB review because it's just like consent for photography. If you take it in a publicly observable location, then it's not under any type of privacy law. Secondary use of anonymous data or samples also may or may not require CREB review. There is a slight wrinkle in that anonymous versus de-identified nomenclature is specifically defined. So anonymous is data which has never been identified. It's collected anonymously. You may use for studies not requiring REB review, but data that is collected, say, on a survey where they provide some personally identifying information, but that information is stripped, and then there may or may not be a master file where you can potentially re-identify that group. That is de-identified and will require CREB review. Further, any QA or QI studies will not require REB review, even if you wanted to publish that. So you can conduct a QA study and you can publish it so long as a priori it was defined as a QA or QI. And individual case reports, limited to 2 studies. So you've gone through this thinking, you've defined your problem, you define your population, you filled out the application, you have the supporting documents, and you hit submit. That generates a meeting on the CREB side, and the first question that the CREB is going to ask is your study minimal risk or not? So if it's minimal risk being defined as any study in which the participant can expect no increased risk versus compared to what they would encounter in their everyday life, then your application will be abbreviated. It's accepted on a rolling basis and requires only individual chair or co-chair review. All other studies are not minimal risk and require a full board review and a full application. So a CREB meeting requires a quorum of 11. There's a chair or 2 co-chairs, an ethicist, lawyer, and a layperson, all providing commentary on your study. The remainder of those positions are derived from UBC faculty from various departments. And any department or school or faculty that submits research ethics applications is supposed to have representation on this board. That's how I got roped into it. Meetings are held twice a month, 3 or 4 hours each, and a week ahead of each meeting, 2 board members are assigned a single application for review and then present to the rest of the board where a decision is rendered after discussion. So there are 4 potential outcomes to an application submitted to the full board. You can have an approved application, so you generate a certificate of approval. You can start conducting your research, start collecting data from that point onward and not before. Provisos may be issued in which you have minor changes that do require some clarification, and those provisos will be issued back to the chair or co-chair of the board, only not a full board review again, so it's an expedited review after that. Your application may be deferred, in which case there are significant issues with the application that require revisiting and will require a resubmission for a full board review once again. So this is a more delayed, more serious issues with your application. And then finally, I've never seen an application outright rejected, but if it is, then you may not apply to other boards. You must resubmit with intent to discuss with the REB directly about why this is being resubmitted and how the changes have, and what changes you've made to it to make it more acceptable. Post-approval activities are a huge amount of work, and these relate to all the other things other than new applications, including annual reviews and amendments and safety data and so on and so forth. And again, minimal risk studies assigned on a rolling basis and reviewed just by the chair of the board. So after each application is discussed ad nauseum by the board, we consolidate that into 4 different domains across this checklist, and those comments are sent back to the PI for revisiting and resubmission. I'm not sure exactly if this is confidential, but I'm not sure. I don't think so. But this is the exact checklist that we used in the Research Ethics Board after each application. So the first domain is background, rational objectives, social and scientific merit, and research design methodology. The next domain is ethics, so the population being studied, recruitment, risk-benefit, and privacy. Those all have to be checked in the positive. Safety, adequate provisions for monitoring. There's an appropriate level of assessment of risk. If this is not controversial research or more frequent monitoring and verification is required. And the final is consent or assent issues, the language of the consent, any waiver requested. They all have to be gone through those 6 different points, and competence of the participants in completing the consent or assent issues. Again, it goes to decision at that point, which has to be voted to a majority. And anyone who's ever filled out a RISE application will see this in the header. So pre-submission, departmental review, changes required at this level, submit to REB, and then REB will have either provisos or a deferral response that's required, and this can go over several cycles prior to being approved through certificate. So sounds like a lot of work. It's a fair amount of paperwork. How much work is it really? Well, the 2014 workload data shows that 178 new applications were submitted, and these are full board applications requiring full board meetings, and 383 were delegated review or minimal risk studies, and over 3,200 post-approval activities had to be reviewed by board members and approved as well, worked through. So an often stated complaint regarding most of the research ethics boards is that it takes a long time, it delays research, it consumes resources, it's not worthwhile. So the Office of Research Ethics decided to try to determine whether that's true or not with data. And so inside RISE, there's certain time points which can be captured as well as internal metrics. So days from the department approval to REB meeting, days from the meeting to provisos entered, days from the first provisos entered to the response, days from the response to certificate approval, and the total duration. So you can see, these dates are certainly long. These are days. So the time from first submission to approval can go up to 84 days before you get your certificate. It would be as low as 59 here, 56. And the question is, whose fault is that? All right. So if you break all this down, this is data that over 2014, and the little arrows show changes from year to year. But if you summarize that, the graph in blue is the CREB responsible timeline, and the time in orange is the PI responsible time. So say you submitted an application and then it goes to REB review, but then it goes back to the PI and it sits on their desk for this amount of time, or it goes back for review and then more provisos submitted and it sits back on their desk for a certain amount of time. And you can see that the CREB is really only responsible for a quarter or less of the total duration of the time required for full approval, even though PIs are complaining that it's the REB's fault. So that was kind of eye-opening and sent back to the PIs in a memo that most of the faculty here have probably gotten last year. Same is true for delegated review or minimal risk. The total times are much shorter, but essentially the REB is responsible only for a quarter of that time as well. And that's been consistent all through this year, 2014 data. Applications by faculty, obviously the Faculty of Medicine is the primary consumer of CREB resources. And in terms of departments, the Department of Urologic Sciences in 2012 data submitted 11 applications compared to Department of Medicine. But of course, Department of Medicine has many sub-specialty departments. And DUS compares relatively favorably. These are the big 4: cardiology, gastro, neurology, and respirology. Those types of trials are mainly pharma-driven clinical trials. So CREB frequently asked questions or pitfalls. One of them being recruitment that I wanted to bring up. So per TCPS2, there is a specific way in which participants need to be recruited and consented. So we need to know the source of the contact information, who's going to collect it, who's going to make contact, and how that's going to happen, when that's going to happen, and the relationship of study team members with participants, as well as those recruitment materials need to be reviewed. So in the past, an MD researcher, so a surgeon scientist, clinician scientist, would have some idea, probably derived from clinical material that they've come across, and then they would look at their clinic charts and support that idea, and then go to their clinic population and start, studying the group. More and more we see that the institutions want separation between the MD and researcher side. So they want this virtual wall in between where these paths, these processes do not cross. Therefore, the MD is now defined as someone providing clinical care and not providing necessarily conducting research on their own population, because they're saying that this is a conflict of interest, and there's issues with regards to coercion of those patients into studies driven by the MD researcher. In fact, that case finding is prohibited specifically in both PCIS PACS and the institutional databases if you read their IT policies. On the researcher side, even though this might be the same person, they want you to pose a question, seek approval, get your resources aligned, and then either have a letter of introduction or permission to contact in place for the study of this population to invite participation. And preferably, they would like the query to be run by a third party supplying de-identified data. This is the obviously super optimal scenario, which rarely occurs. But decision support at BGH is there for that, or say Pop Health BC would be another method by which to get access to data like that. Study team members must be defined on the application a priori. Attending physicians and PIs are in conflict of interest and cannot recruit, although can provide information with regards to existence of that study and information about it. Research assistants, students, residents, fellows, not associated MDs, and nurses may recruit as long as there's no conflict of interest. However, MOAs, office staff, transient students may not recruit and may not consent patients for a study at all.
Chris, that doesn't make sense. I mean, many of us are PIs, many of us recruit our patients into studies and are responsible for getting the consent signed. And providing informed consent. So,
if you're the attending physician or the PI, you're not supposed to do that. Your RA is supposed to do that.
And that's it. And in the US,
it's always been like
that. For your own study, if Martin's leading a study, can I consent patients to his study?
If you're not a co-PI, and if you're not in conflict otherwise.
if you're perhaps if this is an investigator-initiated study, but
if you're the PI on if you're a local PI on a drug-sponsored pharma trial, you may not recruit. You can have your patients in it, but you cannot recruit.
But you could be say to the patient, there's a study for someone like you, go talk to my research associate about it.
Yeah, the prostate center is an example, right? I mean, you see the patient, then you have all your team go in afterwards, right?
yeah, I suppose that's where the line is. I mean, conflict of interest is unavoidable. It has to be managed. It shouldn't be an exclusion. It's something that is managed and discussed.
This is the exact reason why it's like this as part of the management strategy to prevent conflict of interest. Biobanking. Biobanking obviously has come to fore in the past decade or so and is a huge thing. Probably used to be just collecting extra specimen from ORs or biopsies or in your clinic or whatever and just putting them in your local freezer. These days it's come under a lot more regulatory, and UBC has been one of the front runners in biobanking in general and has established a Biobank Research Center. This provides education for PIs and their staff with regards to establishing a new biobank, administering an ongoing biobank, as well as certification and services related to that. In fact, they even provide software for free for setting up a biobank, cataloging, accession, and so on and so forth. There are a number of ins and outs with regards to setting up a proper biobank as opposed to just collecting specimens and chucking them in the freezer. So we often refer people who are establishing new registries and biobanks to this site. One of the things that comes out of biobanking studies is big data. So genomics, metabolomics, proteomics, they generate a lot of data. They generate incidental data. For example, a researcher might be looking at the gene of a specific protein, but they sequence a large portion of the genome, and they might come up with a positive hit on breast cancer gene positivity, or a gene which dictates they might get Alzheimer's at an early age, or Parkinson's or whatnot. How do you manage that? I mean, that's been a more recent issue that CREB has had to wrestle with. The incidental findings are those defined as unanticipated discoveries made in the course of research, but outside the scope of that research. It's a little bit different than material incidental findings, which are those that may impact the welfare of the participants. So in research where incidental findings are more likely, for example, genomics, metabolomics, proteomics, anything generating a large amount of data or not totally focused on a single assay, say, the investigators must submit a plan about how they're going to deal with those findings and disclose any material incidental findings discovered in the course of research. Genome BC reached a consensus with regards to this as well, stating that if it is confirmable, that is, that there's analytic validity to it, then probably worth reporting. If there's a link between the genotype and the phenotype as well, that is probably worth reporting. And if there's an actionable item related to that finding, that should probably be reported as well.
Chris, is there a genomic counselor or genetic counselor involved in the award for genome sequencing-specific grants?
No.
Or, sorry, it gets so complex with the various ones like significant. How do you define what is significant, what is insignificant, etc.?
Yeah, so basically,
Trusting the applicant, their definitions, of how they're going to handle variances that are found.
yes, but if you're targeting, androgen receptor and you come up with, say breast cancer gene or other findings that you become aware of, those have to be reported regardless, right? It's not, well, they only have to be reported if they meet those criteria.
A lot of times we don't know when we get a lot of these
Yep.
identifiable.
Then it's not, then you don't have to report it. You're not necessarily supposed to, direct your ignorance at it, but if you come across it, or then you must report it if it's recognized. If it's not recognized, then you can't be faulted for not recognizing something that's out of your domain. So the big three of research ethics are privacy, safety, and justice. And one of the biggest things that society in general doesn't tolerate is issues about privacy. So this was just came out 2 weeks ago. We see a lot of studies relating to fitness trackers these days, Fitbits, Garmin's, even iPhone now. And researchers have found that these may be vulnerable to monitoring or hacking. So a researcher could monitor a participant's location from remote, as well as know what they're doing at any particular time. And so that is obviously a breach of privacy. This is not limited to just certain studies, but even VCH has been the subject of privacy breaches in the past, whether that's individuals that are casually perusing patient files, or whether that's losses of whole groups of aggregate data on lost hard drives, computers, or USB sticks. This is an obvious issue. These do not relate to studies specifically, but obviously you can see how that would impact security of data for research purposes. To this end, UBC and the Office of the University Counsel has established a privacy office to oversee privacy issues related to these types of things. And they often ask for privacy impact assessments for studies which involve changes in standard procedures or processes. It looks like this. It's just a simple Excel spreadsheet here for the screening part. And the most important elements are the numbers of records they're using, the information types and where it's going to be, and the number of users. If it ends up being medium or high risk, then the privacy office will be involved and require a full review of that study. It goes without saying that UBC itself has regulations regarding management of information and information technology, But University of Alberta has published this online tool called Portage, where you sign up and you sign in, and you can create a data management plan for your research data that goes across these different domains, including collection, appropriate use, how you're going to store and back it up, data protections, legal and privacy, and so on and so forth. So when you're done this, it generates a document that's related to your local IT policy and Canadian regulatory, and a certificate, and those can be uploaded along with your CREB application. UBC itself provides a number of tools to help you in management of security of your data, including virus protection, hardware level encryption of USB hard drives or whole computers, as well as an online storage grid, so you can store all your data through that. Alternatively, Children's and Women's has access to REDCap, which is an open source study assistance, which basically provides end-to-end support for data management. And one final comment. A lot of the studies that we get through CREB are surveys, and to assist in dissemination and collection of survey data, often online tools like SurveyMonkey were used in the past. SurveyMonkey is based in the US, therefore subject to the Patriot Act, or now the Patriot Act is repealed, the Constitution Act, and therefore Canadian researchers were advised not to use it. We were then advised them to move to Fluid Surveys, which is a online survey tool, just like SurveyMonkey, but based in Canada. That got bought out by SurveyMonkey, so that's no longer available. So UBC started their own survey tool, which basically has the same tools, and this is a free service. So if you have a survey, you can just use this tool, collect the data, disseminate your survey, and don't have to worry about any issues with US.
REDCap was bought by SurveyMonkey?
No, Fluid Surveys, which is the Canadian
REDCap is
component.
still okay?
Yes. REDCap is okay because it's just a program, and if your server that you run it on is located in Canada, it's okay.
Survey capability of REDCap is not that good.
Sorry?
REDCap is more a repository for your data. The survey capability of it is not that good. You can't use it with the survey.
Sure you can.
Yeah, no, but these are way better.
Is that right?
Yeah, these are more user-friendly.
I used REDCap last year. It's quite cumbersome. You have to
It's
have
very
You
cumbersome.
have to have a technician walk you through it. But once you make the survey, it's the same as SurveyMonkey.
This one you can do it yourself.
Yeah.
So in summary, fortunately or unfortunately, REBs are an essential part of the research landscape, providing arm's length review from the point of participant protection. And even though I really didn't have much knowledge about REB in the process, I thought it was a big pain in the ass going through it. But if you go through the process of CREB submission, the application, proposal, consent, assent, all the documentation, all of the statistical analysis that's required, the justification thereof, and so on, it certainly gives a firm foundation for a strong study proposal, especially for, say, students, residents, fellows who are not well versed in study design and writing an application like this. And while research ethics is foundational, it also changes based on, it's constantly being revised. And so things may come up that are not covered under current research ethics protocols, which you should discuss with the local research ethics office. And I'd like to thank them to help with this study. And these are the topics that are currently being discussed and new guidelines being written for that I'm not going to talk about now. Thank you very much for your attention.